Welcome to another episode on the Armsoar YouTube channel. I'm Thomas, and today we're going to talk about my radio setup for discus launch gliders. So setting up a DLG on your radio, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult than other gliders or other powered models. And one of the main difficulties is the launch and zoom sequence. So today we'll cover a bunch of things in this video, such as how we use the sequencer function in the Spektrum radios to create our launch and zoom modes, as well as setting up different flight modes, camber, curves, brakes, etc. And if you need a refresher on DLG flight modes, be sure to check out our RC Glider Basics video here, breaking down the different flight modes on a discus launch glider. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you my radio setup on the Spektrum iX20 radio with the Armsoar BAMF 2 DLG running the small and accurate KST X08 and V5 servos. The KST X08 V5s are already a really good value, but KST has asked us to continue running the 20% sale, which means they're an even better value right now. So if you're in Canada or the US, you can get them on armsoarusa.com or armsoar.com for the rest of the world. I've also linked them down below in the description box. Go check it out. Now, back to the radio. The iX20 uses the Android version of Spektrum's Airware operating system. So if you're using a DX or NX radio, then the layout and graphics might look a little bit different, but the principles all stay the same. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up so YouTube will help make it more visible to others who are also searching for DLG videos and tutorials. And of course, if you haven't subscribed already, remember to hit the subscribe button and bell icon so you don't miss our future videos. Before we get started, there are a few things to keep in mind about my radio setup that I'm going to be showing you today. So first off, I push up for flaps. So if you also push up for flaps, then everything is perfect and we're ready to go. But if you pull down for flaps, then your direction in the camber systems where you set up the brakes, that's going to be opposite to mine. And the flap to elevator mix curve, which helps the model not pitch up and keep the correct pitch or attitude, that's going to be in the other direction as well. Now, secondly, I'm going to be doing this demo on my personal BAMF 2, which is a rudderless model, as in I only have 3 servos in the glider and no rudder control. Okay, let's not get into the discussion of rudder versus rudderless. That's not why we're here today. You'll just need to keep that in mind when you don't see the rudder subtrim or aileron to rudder mix activated in my program. But don't worry, I'll show you where those are. Speaking of which, my ISPM file will be linked below, so if you want to go ahead and just use my program, please feel free to do so. Thirdly, I build my models with an offset on both the flaperons and the elevator, so this helps maximize the performance of my linkage geometry. What that means is, in terms of flaperons, they're offset downwards a little bit, since you only need about 15 millimeters or so of upward deflection, but you want the most down deflection possible for your brakes. Similarly, the elevator only needs enough up elevator to touch the boom, and the maximum down deflection to push over with authority at the apex of the launch. Mechanically offsetting these surfaces maximizes the useful travel while maintaining the highest accuracy and torque possible. Number 4, even though things are much more structured and predefined in Airware operating system compared to, say, OpenTX, which I absolutely love, there are usually more than one way to achieve a result. And of course, if you know a better way to do something, please leave a comment down below. Alright, so first off, let me walk you through my switches. So I'm using the bind button switch as my momentary preset for the launch. I moved it from the I position to the A position. Actually, the lines are long enough inside, so I didn't have to resolder anything. I just swapped the places. Now, switch B is what I use to control my regular flight mode, so speed, cruise, and thermal. And in the thermal mode, I can actually use switch C to bring it to thermal B if I wanted to. And realistically, those are all the switches I use on a DLG setup, so it's super simple. I don't have low rates and high rates. I simply use a lot of travel, and then I have some expo in the center that helps smooth it out. And if I really did need to make a hard maneuver, I just bang my sticks and the plane will come around. For those of you using the newer Spektrum radios, you should really take advantage of the on-the-fly or OTF feature. Essentially, it allows you to change certain parameters while in flight, so it really helps speed up that whole setup and trimming process. Personally, my top left trim over here, it adjusts my aileron differential. My left trim over here adjusts my camber, and my right trim over here adjusts my global elevator. I'm mode 2, so the flap stick and rudder is on the left, and aileron and elevator is on the right. There are two main menus in Airwear. So the first one is model adjust. This is where you do all the things such as, travel adjustments, subtrim, camber, mixes. And the second one is the model setup. This is where you set up the model structure, such as flight modes, telemetry, switch setup, things like that. First, let's take a look at our sailplane type. So go into model setup and sailplane type. You'll have to turn off your RF. And for the wing, you can actually use 2 aileron, that works, but I do prefer to use 2 aileron, 2 flaps. It gives you a few more predefined mixes that it just sometimes comes in handy. In terms of the tail, it's just normal. And motor is inhibit because it's a DLG, we don't have a motor. So the next step is to take a look at the sequencer. So go into model adjust, sequencer. And it's going to be the first one here because that's the only sequencer I have set up for this. Let's go inside. As you can see, the switch, it's set up for switch. It says switch I because remember, I just swapped the places. So this position is actually switch I now. So switch I on my button preset, that's what triggers this sequencer. Sequences go either in forward direction or reverse direction. So in this case, we're not going to be using forward, we're just using the reverse. And I'm using 3 seconds as the length of my sequence. Channel A is going to be launch A, which is my launch preset. And channel B is going to be the zoom, speed B in this case. From here you can scroll down and you'll see there's a forward section, which we're not using. And we're just focusing on the reverse section. So I'll bring this up so you can take a quick look what it looks like. And actually, if you take a look, I'm just going to hit the launch preset button and you'll see it moving past the zoom mode and into my regular flight modes. So that's the sequencer for your launch sequence. Next, let's go back out and then we'll go into model setup and flight mode setup. So again, we'll have to turn off the RF for this. Flight mode setup is where we will define which switch controls flight modes and in what combinations the flight modes activate. In this case, switch 1 is going to be speed B. That's the sequencer we just finished setting up. Switch 2 is going to be switch B, which is this here, controlling my regular flight modes. And switch 3 is going to be switch C. So it's this switch over here, and that controls going from the regular thermal 1 to my thermal 2. Now you'll notice there's nothing in priority switch, and I don't have a landing mode, but we'll go over that later on in the video near the end, showing you how to set up a dedicated landing mode if you wanted to do that. Now that we're finished with the right-hand side of the screen, let's take a quick look at the left-hand side. You'll see on the right column, it just says launch. That's basically for when I push down the launch button, regardless of what combination the other switches are in, it's going to go into launch mode. Likewise, once the sequencer kicks in the middle, it's going to go in speed B mode, which is my zoom. Now the left-hand side is where you're going to have to spend a little bit more time to configure. So these are a combination of these 2 switches. So switch B and C. So in this case, C is all the way up to position 0 and B is all the way up to position 0 as well. So that's going to be speed. Once I bring this into the middle, it's cruise and then thermal. Now, regardless of what position this switch is in, as long as this is in position 0, it's always going to be in speed. See, I set it up so it's always in speed. Likewise in cruise, it'll hit cruise. If I move this, it's also in cruise. And if it's not in cruise, then you can reassign your current flight mode and just select cruise A. The only difference is when this is swapped over to position 2, now this becomes more active. So when this is all the way up in position 0, it's in thermal 1. And if I pull it down, then it becomes thermal 2. Now that we're finished with the flight modes, let's just go back for a couple more basics. First off, model adjustment, servo setup. We want to make sure all of our surfaces are moving in the correct directions. So under the reverse tab, you'll notice the left and right aileron are both normal direction. Elevator, in my case, it needs to be reversed, and I don't have a rudder. Next step go into the mixing menu, and I made a P-Mix 1, which is always on for the elevator. You'll notice this is -30 right now. You can do it at -30, -40, -50. It's not a big deal. So you choose whatever number you want. It's always on. And on the OTF, I have this set up as right trim digital, so over here. Basically, this mix is what I use to set up my global elevator trim. So let's say I go to the field and I feel that the model is a couple clicks too much down, then I just hit this twice and I can continue flying. I don't have to go into Subtrim and change the Subtrim of the model. It just makes it very, very fast and simple. Now let's go back. Once we're done the P-Mix for the global elevator, let's go into Camber system, and this is where we're going to set up the brakes. So you'll notice in my case, the spoiler stick is the input. Most gliders, you're going to use the spoiler stick as the input. There's no offset, and we don't have flaps, so flaps are 0 for both values. Now there are ailerons, right? So right now you'll notice nothing is moving on the wing. What we need to do is, okay, for the flap stick, when it's all the way up, we want it so that the flaperons go all the way down, which is -100. Okay. Now we're still quite a bit offset. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the down position of the flaperon stick when it's down, which is, off. I'm going to move this up to, let's say, 30%. Nice round even number. And this brings my aileron basically flush. It's not quite flush, but we'll fine tune it in Subtrim later. And so now you'll see I have smooth, gradual brakes along the whole travel of my flap stick. Next, I go back out and go into Servo Setup again, and then we're going to take a look at the travel tab. Basically, I use this to make sure my stick deflection and surface deflections are in sync. I also use it to make sure my left and right aileron endpoints are balanced. So that's something you'll have to take a look at. And you'll notice everything is ±150 instead of ±100. This just makes use of the entire travel range. Once I make sure everything is ±150, then I check my deflections and make sure my ailerons are balanced on both sides, and also the same for my elevator. Now let's take a look at the elevator as an example. You'll remember that I have a lot of offset on my elevator, so it actually trims off a lot of my travel, my stick travel, at the end of the deflection, so this doesn't move anymore. So what we need to do is go into elevator, the up direction, pull your stick all the way up, and basically move this value down until it starts moving the elevator again. So let's say 105, I think that works. See, now even at the very end of the stick travel, the elevator is working. All right, and that's it for the travel section. So we're finished with the travel tab. Now let's take a quick look at Subtrim. So you remember in Camber systems, we've already set up a 30% offset on the flaperons, and they're very close to flush now, but we're still a little bit off. So over here, left aileron, let's move it down by 6. And the right aileron, let's move it down by -79. Now everything is perfectly flush. Same thing for the elevator. I'm going to move it up to 312. Now I know these values because this plane is already set up, but you're going to have to move this around just to make sure all your surfaces center. Now that everything is all centered, your wings, ailerons, rudder, this is where the rudder is going to be at. Let's go back out. And then we're going to go to camber presets. Essentially, this is where we're going to be looking at how much camber would be in each flight mode. So let's start off in speed mode. We're going to leave it at 0. Everything's already flush. Cruise, in mine, I have -18 on both sides, -52 on both sides. For the launch, it's 0 because I also have flush. And then for zoom, it's a reflex, 15% up. You can also adjust your elevator values here, but since the elevator trims are pretty close and fine between the different flight modes, I just use the regular elevator trim to adjust that when I'm flying each independent flight mode. The only exception to that is for the launch preset, because there is quite a bit more up elevator compared to any other mode. So for that, when I press my button down, it's going to bring me to the launch mode. And on elevator, I have -60. Once I let go, everything is back to 0. The last thing we're going to do in this menu is aileron OTF or camber OTF. Now you'll notice aileron OTF is activated. So as you recall, my left trim can help increase or decrease my camber in a particular flight mode if I wanted to. So for an example, sometimes I might want to increase the camber on my cruise mode slightly if I have a lot of ballast in the model. So OTF really makes that easy to do when I'm flying. The way you would set up the aileron OTF is just to come here, hit that, which trimmer you're going to use, hit that, and then just move whatever trim you want and it'll automatically detect that. In my case, I've set -100 or 100. So those are the limits on how much value that can change. Now let's hit back and back. We're going to go into dual rates and expo. So you can see here on channel, you can choose between aileron, elevator, and rudder. So let's take a look at aileron first. It's also set up on a switch by flight mode. So I don't have dual rates in the sense where I can just flip a switch and then I get more rates or less rates. My switch is the flight mode, so I have different rates on each flight mode. Now, I like to keep it relatively simple, so on my speed mode, I have a little bit less. It's just at 66% with 30% expo. My cruise, thermal, and thermal B are the same. They're all at 80% rate at 30% expo. On my launch preset and on my zoom, I only have 30% rates. So when it's climbing, I can still make a little bit of trajectory change, but let's say I accidentally hook onto my stick on my shirt or something when I'm launching the model, it's not going to be doing something catastrophic. The next part is the elevator. You'll see I have 80% on my speed and then 100% up on cruise, thermal, and thermal B. I have 25% expo on all the modes. What you'll see is I have 125% of down on all of these regular flight modes. And the reason is, going back to the sequencer, this is a 3-second sequencer for my launch. But actually, I'm launching about 3.5 seconds of climb time. I'm at roughly 65, 70 meters or so. And that's about 3.5 seconds. And so the last half second or so, I'm usually actually climbing in speed mode. And so I want to have a lot of down elevator authority so that I can push over really quickly. So that's why it's at 125% on the down elevator. Of course, I don't have a rudder on this, so I don't have anything set up on my rudder rates and expo, but I presume you're going to have a rudder, so that's where you would do that. Next, we're going to go into differential, and very simply on the switch, I use flight mode as the switch again because I have different differentials for all my different flight modes. Actually, this particular value I just set up blind. I don't really look at what the numbers are. Aileron OTF, I've set it up so that my left top trim is controlling my value for the differential. So I just fly it in the air and I move this up and down until it feels right for each mode. So just to let you guys see, in my speed mode, I have -15%. On my cruise, I have -17. Thermal, I have -13. And thermal B, also -13. Once the model is dialed in, I'm not really going to touch the differential, but it really does speed up the whole trimming process, especially when you're doing a brand new setup for a plane. So I'm not going to go into detail about timers and audio events, things like that, you know, calling out flight modes. All of these, you can find them in your menu, audio events, and then you have all the different audios that you can set up. For example, spoken flight modes, you can do that in here. Timer reports, you can set up how your timer 1 and timer 2 behaves. And of course, telemetry, you have telemetry warning, inside audio event, or you can go into the telemetry menu and you can set up what your panels look like. But those are all relatively simple. So based on your preference, you can have that all set up the way you want. So before we're done, let's take a quick look at some of the other mixes. And we're going to go back into model adjust and then mixing. And let's take a look at elevator to flap. So essentially this is snap flaps. I also have this on the switch flight mode, so the values are dependent on the flight mode instead of having a physical switch. On speed mode, I have no snap flaps, but on cruise and thermal, I have 5% up and down. So on the upside, I have 5%, down I have negative 5%. The way snap flaps works is when I pull my elevator, the camber on my wings would come down a little bit. And when I'm pushing my elevator stick, then the wings will come up a little bit into reflex. So the way this works is it just makes the turns a little bit more efficient. Next, let's take a look at the flap to elevator mix. This is what's used to keep your model in the correct pitch angle when you're deploying flaps. So over here in flap to elevator, I'm using a 5-point curve. And as you can see, it starts off with moving more elevator in relation to my flaps coming down. And the further the flaps come down, you'll notice the elevator isn't actually increased very much, so it kind of plateaus off. So this makes the landing approach very, very smooth. One thing to keep in mind is when you're applying flaps for brakes, and I'm here, talking about the correct pitch angle and everything, it doesn't mean the angle of the plane doesn't change. Actually, the fuselage you'll see points more and more downward as you apply more flaps and the appropriate amount of elevator compensation. And that's because if you don't apply enough elevator compensation to bring the nose down, your plane is going to want to balloon up. Now, of course, if you're pulling down for flaps instead of pushing up like me, then this curve is basically flipped along the horizontal axis. In this case, my glider is a rudderless model, so I don't have aileron to rudder mix. But if you do have a rudder, which again, I think you probably will, then come into here, aileron to rudder mix. And this is where you would have this all set up. Now for my own ruddered models, I use aileron to rudder mix, and of course the switch is on the flight mode, like all my other parameters. And it's always on, so sub switch is set to on. Lastly, let's briefly take a look at how to do a separate landing mode that is activated by the flap stick. So first, let's go into the model setup, which we are in right now, and then go into analog switch setup. So we're going to take a look at the throttle stick. So there's going to be position 0, 1, and 2, and these numbers represent the threshold between 0 and 1, and 1 and 2. So between 0 and 1, we're at 75% positive. Between 1 and 2, we're at negative 75%. So right now, this number corresponds to what position your stick is in right now. So we're in negative 100%, so we're in position 2. Once we go past negative 75%, you're now in position 1 of the switch. And once we're past 75, we're in position 0. So this is the first step you have to do. So next you'll go back into the flight mode, and then remember priority switch, I have it inhibit because my flap stick works all the time. I don't have a separate landing mode. But now that we're doing a separate landing mode, you would go into here, press that, move your flap stick, and that has priority over all your other flight modes. In its downward position, we're going to have it as inhibit. And once it goes past negative 75% and enters position 1 and position 2, I've assigned it to landing A. So now you have a separate landing mode that is activated by your flap stick once it goes over 25% of movement. Now the benefits of having a separate landing mode is you can set up completely different parameters for that particular flight mode, such as maximum rates in terms of ailerons or more positive differential. It just helps you get a little bit more controllability when your flaps are down. That's it for today's video. We went through quite a few features on the radio, and by now you should have a really good understanding on the Airware operating system. I've used a lot of radios, and I can say Airware is probably one of the easiest, if not the easiest one to set up, at least for 95% of the tasks at hand. There are a few things that are a little bit harder, such as the sequencer, but once you understand it, it makes a lot of sense. So if you have any comments, questions, or requests, please leave a comment down below. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.